everybody, I am Jared Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to How Did Amsterdam Become the Jerusalem of the West? History of Jewish Amsterdam 1500 to 2024 by History with Hilbert. Now this reaction is slightly different than the majority of reactions I do because most reactions I do either deal with DNA testing or at least genealogy in some sort of way. This is just a straight up history video. Now the reason why I'm doing this reaction, and I think I may start doing more reactions to history videos like this, is because I have a very special expertise in the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, as well as Dutch Jews and Jews in Amsterdam altogether. A large part of this being that I descend from the Dutch Jewish communities of Amsterdam, both the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardi community, and I've researched them extensively through my genealogy research and just through general history research. For those familiar with my regular channel Genie Vlogger, you may have seen my own video about the founding of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, as well as different record sets that the Dutch Jews held, such as the video I did about the records for Israel dating back 400 years. And another thing that's going to be uncommon with this video is that I actually have already seen it. Basically, I saw the video was available, I had never seen it before and was like, oh, that's awesome. Watched it without thinking about doing it as reaction. And then afterwards, I had some comments, and I actually did put a comment in there. And then it was like a couple of days later, I was thinking about the video, and I was like, that would have been a perfect reaction. So I decided I'm going to react to it anyway, because I think I can pull up a lot of really cool and interesting things to discuss some of the issues that I had with it, as well as kind of just expand on a lot of what's discussed, because it is a really good video overall. With all that said, let's jump into the video.
How do you say this name? Do you say Amsterdam? Do you say Amsterdam? Or do you say Amsterdam? Well, however you say it, we all know that we are referring, of course, to the capital of the Netherlands. But did you know that for a large part of its history, and still today, it also has another name? This is Mokum, a name that
a lot of my cousins who still live in the Netherlands call it Mokum.
Many people from Amsterdam, and indeed some from outside of Amsterdam, also know is short for the longer expression Mokum Aleph. But this sounds nothing like Amsterdam. Is this some kind of local dialect or some weird Frisian name for the place? Well, if we write it in its original script, this may give you a clue. This is, in fact, Yiddish, of course, the words being taken from Hebrew for safe haven, and this was the name that was given to Amsterdam by its Jewish population, of whom there were quite a few throughout history and indeed still today. Now, this became known in the 17th and later centuries as the Jerusalem of the West. And in today's video, I'd like to find out, how did Amsterdam become the Jerusalem of the West? What is its Jewish history, and why did it get this moniker? Well, to find out why, we have to go back to 1492, the year in which the Spanish Queen Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada from the Moors, ending the period of history we know as La Reconquista.
Now, a very interesting thing about this image right here, the man in the cloak, they're not sure who this is, but one of the people they believe it may be is one of my ancestors, Don Abraham Sr. Sometimes he's called Abraham Sr. Coronel, sometimes Abraham Cornell, but Don Abraham Sr. mostly is the way that it's put. But an interesting thing about Don Abraham is that he was the person who got King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella together. And so the story of this painting, they're not sure what it is exactly or who it is, but the belief is that it is Don Abraham pleading with the king and queen not to enact the Alhambra decree, which obviously that didn't happen, or that did happen obviously, but what he wanted didn't happen. And an interesting thing about him as well is that he was really old. I think he was born 1401 or something, so he was in his 90s, 91, when this happened, when the Alhambra decree was signed. And he then converted along with one of his sons, but he was considered one of the last exilarchs. And because of that, it was a big scandal throughout the Jewish world that he actually converted instead of leaving, because the Jews of Spain were given 4 months to leave. So, all right, let's continue.
But also signing into law the Alhambra decrees at that famous castle in Granada. which basically forced the remaining Jewish and Muslim populations to either convert to Christianity or to leave. Many of the Jewish population and indeed the Muslim population decided to leave Spain for good, moving to a variety of destinations around Europe and North Africa. But what's less well known is that 4 years later, in 1497, the Portuguese king also issued such an ultimatum, except there was one key difference, which was that people were not allowed to leave at all, but simply had to convert.
Now, this is actually a really great point in the video that I kind of wish he hit with a bit more emphasis. It's a very common misconception that a lot of people will say, well, with the Spanish Inquisition, they forced the conversions. And while technically that's true, technically it's wrong, because it was you have 4 months to leave or you have to convert or die. And with Portugal, it was just you had to convert. And so a very common story that, from my understanding, isn't true is that with Portugal, they said that the Jews could leave, but then blocked the ports. But from my understanding, that's more of a myth than something that actually happened. Although I wouldn't be surprised if it may have happened at a couple of ports, you know. But just a very important point to hit on when it comes to the history of the Inquisition.
So the Jewish population in Portugal had to convert to Catholicism, and they became known as conversos. However, in reality, most of the Jewish population were Jews still in secret, but outwardly identified as Catholics to comply with the law. This state of affairs was continued for around a century because while in Spain the Inquisition was rampant,
nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
In Portugal, the Inquisition hardly got off the ground, and so many Jews were able to continue being covertly Jewish. However, the Portuguese government did start to turn the screw as time went on, meaning that for its converso population, they started to look for a new place to call home. Now, Amsterdam and the rest of the Low Countries may not have been a very obvious choice. For one, it was cold, it was far away, there were hardly any Jews living there or other communities that they could easily attach themselves to. But in 1579, those northern provinces of what would become the Netherlands signed the Union of Utrecht. This bound being between those northern provinces who had fought for independence against the Spanish and continued to do so. What was important about this union was that because of the Protestant or Calvinist religion of many of the northern Dutch, they had enshrined within their constitution in this Union of Utrecht a degree of religious toleration for various religions. And so Portuguese Jews started to move to the Netherlands, the conversos going back. However, having lived underground for so long and not being able to openly practice crucial elements of the Jewish religion, the Portuguese Jews were unsure of what it meant to be Jewish in the fullest religious sense. And so, going back to Amsterdam, where they were allowed to practice in the open, they actually had to get help from other Jewish communities from Eastern and Central Europe, the Ashkenazim communities, to teach them in the Torah and indeed in religious practice. This was done when a rabbi from Emden in Germany was sent for, of course, modern-day Germany. At the time, Germany was many different states. His name was Moses Uri Halevi, and under his tutelage, the burgeoning Portuguese Jewish community were able to reconnect with their traditional faith and to practice in the open.
Moses Uri Halevi is a very important figure in the history of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, for obvious reasons, as explained in this video. This is a topic that I touched on in my video about the founding of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, because there's a lot of myths surrounding Moses Uri Halevi, and it largely has to do with that his history was mostly written by his grandson. And so there's a few things that the grandson says that are questionable of if they actually happened or if maybe he's just kind of giving a little bit of flair to it. But part of the story is that the reason they had Moses Uri Halevi come through was because the Jews that were trying to make their way to Amsterdam were thrown off course and ended up landing in Emden, Germany, and it just ran across his house because they saw that a duck was being brought to his house. So it's a really interesting story. That's only like the little bit beginning part of it. Go check out my video on my main channel about that after this video if you want to learn more about that. But an interesting character, and really shows that the research that Hilbert did on this video very good, very high quality, because this is not something most people cover, and a lot of times when they do cover it, they get a lot of stuff wrong. And there are a few things that he does kind of get a little off, and I'll go into those when I get to it, but largely, like this, very, very good.
But not everything was plain sailing, and it turned out to be a very lengthy process to get an actual synagogue up and running in Amsterdam, which happened in 1670.
Now, he's glossing over a lot of stuff here. So what he's glossing over is that in the beginning, there were two communities, two Sephardic communities. There was Beth Jacob and there was Nev Shalom. And there was an infighting thing that happened. I think it was Nev Shalom, and then there was a third community. So there's three main communities, and in 1639, those three communities came together. Now, those communities already had their own synagogue. So what he said before about it took until 1670 to have a synagogue, that's not completely true. But the main synagogue, Esnoga, what's there today, Esnoga, it's, that's the big one, but there were synagogues before that. Now, 1639, all three come together, call themselves Kahal Kadosh, Talmud Torah. If you go to Esnoga, you'll notice throughout that there's an image of swans, and that's to represent the three original communities. So what he said there, that's kind of wrong. So to show that, I've brought up the Archive of Amsterdam's page. That's the inventory number 334, Archief van de Portuguese Israëligement. Pronounce that terribly. And these are the records of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam. And so when we pull it up like this, we can see that the archive is broken first into the three communities, Beth Jacob, Nev Shalom, and the third, Beth Israel. So when we look, the oldest records we have for the Portuguese Jewish community are these records, this record from 1614 to 1630. I'm going to do an English translation here so you can see register containing regulations, decisions, and statements of income and expenditure of the Bethlehem Cemetery in Ouderkerk aan de Amstel, also serving as a gravebook and funeral register. And when we look at the first page, it goes into the details about the cemetery. And so this is the oldest record. Now, interesting thing to note here, because I'll talk about it in a bit, this that they're using here, this is Old Portuguese. This is not Ladino, which developed in the Eastern Sephardic world, whereas Amsterdam was part of the Western Sephardic world, which I'm going to talk about probably in a bit, about the Sephardic diaspora, the three waves that we often talk about. So thought this would be kind of an interesting way to show this part of things, but we have a lot of records that go back to the early 1600s, well before 1670, and we can see a lot of the things going on, and we can read about what's happening, and we can see the money coming in and out of each of the various communities. Now, there is a limitation on a lot of these records, and when we go back and look at that one page, you can even see that there's a lot of damage here. There's a lot of damage to some of these books, and unfortunately, some of it is lost, and some pages are worse than others, but we have a lot of information.
But when that synagogue was built, it was the largest synagogue in the world at that time, Portuguese Synagogue, or as it was called in the language of the Portuguese Jews, the Esnora or Snora became a staple of Portuguese Jewish life in Amsterdam. And unlike Catholic cathedrals, which were also in Amsterdam but had to look from the outside as ordinary buildings, this was quite clearly a synagogue.
So I'm going to go back just a little bit. So this is the synagogue right here on the right, and there's an outer sort of wall area. I call it a wall, but it's not really even a wall because it's actually a building unto itself. So it's like this outer building that surrounds the synagogue, and then you have the synagogue itself in the middle. So that's the synagogue itself in the middle, and then you have those outer buildings. And so in those outer buildings, that's where there's a lot of the places that they store stuff. There's the different offices and things. They also have what's known as the winter snoga, the synagogue that they use in the winter, because this is an old school synagogue. So it would take a lot of stuff to keep it warm, that big synagogue. So they had a smaller room that was easier to keep warm during the winter. And actually, when I went and attended services at Snoga last year, that was where we had our services held. That's where I saw them. But they have a lot of other stuff there. Also, part of that outer, the surrounding building sort of thing is Etz Chaim, the famous library, which was originally a school that was part of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. All right, let's continue.
To look from the outside as ordinary buildings, this was quite clearly a synagogue. Different also to other areas where Jews lived in Europe was the lack of ghettoization of the community in Amsterdam, which partially came as a result because this community had moved in from abroad as migrants. Many of the inhabitants of Amsterdam at this time, which was a booming city, were also migrants. And so the fact that these Jews had arrived, they were not too dissimilar from other people also arriving in the area. They were also not forced to live in one part of the city, as had been done in other cities in Europe, and so were able to spread around several areas, even though a Jewish district did develop.
Yeah, that Jewish district is, I don't know, it's hard to tell with the older map, but it's basically kind of like here-ish, is that Jewish district. It's kind of, I guess it's probably like right about here.
Some of the very wealthiest Portuguese Jewish merchants would also live in the fanciest houses in Amsterdam, aside non-Jewish or genteel houses as well. Many famous Jews settled and were born in Amsterdam. One of them was Manasseh ben Israel, who would be one of the foremost philosophers and rabbinic authorities at the time. His student, Baruch Spinoza, would perhaps even outlive his fame.
Baruch Spinoza, one of those characters that I think is talked about more than any other character from the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam.
Although in the end, they would come to blows over philosophical and rabbinic authority. Baruch Spinoza in 1656 being excommunicated from the community by his former masters.
Now, interesting thing to note about this portrait is that a lot of people hate this because it depicts the Sephardic Jews incorrectly. They're all dressed like Eastern European Sephardic Jews. The way that Baruch Spinoza is dressed is the way the whole community dressed. And this painting, if my understanding is correct, was made by someone hundreds of years later, and I believe that they were Ashkenazi Jewish. Not 100% sure, but basically what's being represented here is very, very wrong. Another thing to note, and I think he's going to talk about this in a second, is that a lot of people will talk about that Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated because of his beliefs and the things that he was doing and all of that. And it's actually, from my understanding, not 100% sure the exact reason why he was excommunicated. We do have kind of a vague idea. And why that is because of the entry for his harem, which comes from what's known as the Eschamat books, the books of decisions by the Board of the Muhammad. The Board of the Muhammad being the board of members that control the community, that basically they're the ones that make the decisions. So going back to the archives, we can actually find those records down here, the Eschamat books, and in this is where we can find Baruch Spinoza's harem. So here we have image 248, and down here on the bottom right, here we have the harem, and we can see for Baruch against contra Baruch Espinoza. So a lot of people call him Baruch Spinoza, but the family name was de Espinoza. His father was Michael de Espinoza. And so this gives the details of the reason for the harem. Now, the thing with most of the decisions of the Muhammad is they don't actually give the reasoning behind it. They just tell you what's going on. So they're just really saying, here is the harem. Now, I believe that there's a translation online. So here is Minnesota State University, and they have the translation of this. And so you can see the Lords of the Muhammad, the governing body of Six Parnasim and the Gabai, announced that having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways, but having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable hearsays which he practiced and taught, and about his monstrous deeds, and having for this numerous trustworthy, etc., etc. I'm not going to read it all. So they kind of give a generalized, like, yeah, we don't like what he's doing, but they don't say specifically, here's exactly what he's doing that we don't like, and here's, what we want him to do. All right, let's continue.
For his views on God, on religion, and the authority of the rabbis. Of course, Spinoza would tally along many of the great philosophers of Europe, together with his ideas that were in some ways shared by René Descartes, who at that time also lived around the Netherlands. The city's merchants and the government of the Dutch Republic also stood to gain much from these newcomers from the Iberian Peninsula, particularly when the Dutch would go to war on the high seas with the Portuguese, who were allied with the Spanish, their enemy to the south. Because many of these Jews had been important merchants in Portugal, they had insider information of how the Portuguese mercantile empire worked, and so they were able to give this information to the Dutch, and indeed, together with the Dutch, they were able to wrest many of these Portuguese colonies from their former masters and give it to the Dutch, particularly the East Indies Company. One such example is that through connections of one of the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam with family members living in Portuguese Brazil, the Dutch were able to surprise the Portuguese and capture the colony of Brazil, which remained Dutch for several decades before being won back by the Portuguese.
Part of my ancestry is traced to the Recife community in Brazil, which is what he's talking about. What happened to that community is 1654, it was taken back over and lost, and thus everyone had to leave. And so my family that was there ended up going back to Amsterdam, but a big part of that community from Recife ended up in New York, and those were the people who founded the community at West 72nd Street and West Central Park, I think it is. So if you're familiar with that synagogue, that's kind of the origins of it. But an interesting thing is that any Dutch colony that there was, which there were a good amount of them, any Dutch colony, there was going to be a Sephardic community in that colony. And a large part of that community was going to have come directly from the Amsterdam community. And so we see this in Suriname, we see this in Curacao, we see this in Indonesia, although Indonesia I don't think quite as much, not quite as big a community, but we see these strong connections, and I know he's going to talk about this in a bit, and I'm going to have some things to correct there.
Indeed, many of those first Dutch trading settlements in India and around the Indies and the Pacific were originally Portuguese colonies that the Dutch were able to capture from them. Perhaps even more important than this military information were the commercial ties and networks between various Sephardic Jewish populations around the world, which these now in the Netherlands settled Jews were able to tap into, partially because they could speak the same Ladino language, or at least a very closely related form of this language.
So he kind of saves himself there by saying, or a language kind of like Ladino. But at this part, what's happening is I think there's a lot of confuddle and confusion about the history of the diaspora that clears a lot of this up and explains why the communities were connected and did not have to do with language. So when we talk about the Sephardic diaspora, it starts with the first wave, known as the Eastern Sephardic wave. And these Jews were the Jews that had left well before 1492, tracing back into the 1300s. 1391 was kind of a really big year for this wave. But they went to the Ottoman Empire. So this is where the communities of Thessalonica, Istanbul, or whatever you want to call the cities, whether the old names or the new names, just areas in the Ottoman Empire, and that was the Eastern Sephardic wave. Then 1491, 1492, we get what's known as the North African Sephardic wave. This wave coincides obviously with the finalizing of the Reconquista, the fall of Granada, and thus the Alhambra Decree. And so what happens is all that's happening, the Jews that are leaving, especially within that 4-month period, mostly are going to North Africa, partially because it's just right there. It's right across the strait. So you can get right there very easy. Then you have all the Jews that go to Portugal, as he talked about. He talks about the history perfectly. The Jews that went to Portugal, once they start to leave, they're known as the Western Sephardic diaspora. The Jewish nation, the Hebrew Portuguese nation, or some variation of it. So like with the Amsterdam community, where they're the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, the Portuguese Israelite Gemeente. But all of these communities that are part of the Western Sephardic diaspora are connected very strongly for a lot of reasons, mostly because they're all related to each other. So these communities include Amsterdam, Livorno, Italy, Bayonne and Bordeaux in France, Hamburg, London, Curacao, Jamaica, Suriname, and then many other places as well, but those are kind of like the big ones. Antwerp was kind of a big one too. But even more than that, we have records from the communities known as despacho records where they're telling us how much money they're giving to specific community members to move and settle in one of the other communities. So this page I've pulled up is known as the Despachos Project, which is part of A Nação, prosopography of the Portuguese Jewish nation. So like I said, the Western Sephardic diaspora. And it goes into a lot of the information about these records. But here we have an example of one of those where it's listing the people, the amount of money they're getting, and then you can see where they're going. So we see this person here, London. Then looks like Leon, Italia, Barbados. And so we actually can see the movement with these records of community members back and forth between all these communities. And these people would go around the world like crazy. I mean, the fact that they were merchant families, you know, even the poor were connected to these merchant families and things in various ways. And so a lot of people would be supported through the community, especially the poor, and they would have all these different things of, okay, well, let's try to send them here and maybe they'll be able to get up on their feet or things like that.
With which they were able to create trading connections with partners in the Caribbean, in trading posts in Africa, as well as in the Indies and across Europe. For more, see this video on the Judeo-Spanish language.
Now, the Judeo-Spanish language, Ladino and all that develops in the Eastern Sephardic communities, the Eastern Sephardic wave. Now, remember, the Eastern Sephardic wave happens well before the Western Sephardic wave. They're separated by a couple of centuries. And while the Western Sephardic communities had a lot of connections to the Eastern Sephardic communities in multiple ways, there wasn't a super strong connection that would lead to the community all of a sudden adopting Ladino. So the Jews in Amsterdam, the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, they basically use an old version of Portuguese. And every time I've ever had Portuguese translators translate these records from the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, they're always so intrigued because they can tell that it's old Portuguese, but that there's kind of a slight variation of it versus a lot of what they see in Portugal. And so it's really cool to kind of see that, but it's not Judeo-Spanish or Ladino or anything like that. Those are different.
What this language actually looked like. Now, in 1748, it was thanks to the intervention of the Pinto family member, which was a Sephardic Jewish family in Amsterdam.
House de Pinto still exists. I went and visited there. I connect into the Pinto family. So, yeah.
That alone was given to the Dutch stadtholder Willem IV, with which he was able to oppose the French army that had invaded the Netherlands. Later, he would say that de Pinto had single-handedly managed to save the state. His successor, Willem V, is known to have visited both the Portuguese and the new German synagogue in the Dutch Republic in Amsterdam. And so these Sephardic Jews had many connections with various other trading areas that the Dutch also traded with. It's known, for instance, that they had close contact with the Jewish community in Antwerpen.
For the exact reasons I talked about, as Antwerp was part of the Western Sephardic wave. The Sephardic community in Antwerp is one that I've recently been studying. I just got a book recently. So I have this wonderful book, which is the Hebrew-Portuguese nations of Antwerp and London at the time of Charles V and Henry VIII. Trying to be better at my history with the Antwerp community because I don't know as much about it. But a great example, once again, the Hebrew-Portuguese nations. They considered themselves a nation. So that was the big connection.
Often that brides would come from Antwerpen to marry the men of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam.
This was happening from all of the communities. the women were coming from all the communities marrying. And those despachos, sometimes we get those to show. And in fact, even more than the despachos, talking about women, we have the dowry of Amsterdam. Very famous, happens every year. There's a lot of records on the dowries being part of what's known as dotar. So I figured I'd pull up this post, the Jerusalem Post, caring for brides, the Dotar Society of Amsterdam. And so here we see, this is a very typical Portuguese Jewish style of dressing with the top hat. So think about that image of Baruch Spinoza we saw before, and I was saying Those didn't look like Western Sephardic Jews. We can even see in modern times that this is a common thing. So if you go to the London community as well, Bevis Marks, very similar style with the hats and the dress and all of that. It's a very Western Sephardic minhag. But the thing about Dotar records is that we can see brides from all the various communities. So basically what Dotar was that a bride would kind of be put up as eligible, and if a man married that bride within a certain amount of time, then they were eligible as a couple to receive a dowry, a sum of money to help support them. And so we have women from all these various communities being part of Dotar, and so we can even see the women from the different communities being married and who they marry. Obviously in genealogy we see that as well, just by building the family trees. And within my own family tree, I connect to all of the different communities. Like I mentioned Recife, but also Jamaica, Curacao, Hamburg, Bayonne, Bordeaux, Livorno. I mean, London, I can literally trace my family to every single one of these communities that was part of the Portuguese Hebrew nation.
There were also Portuguese Jews who would end up in New Amsterdam, today's New York, where their descendants remain. Others would go to Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, to Batavia, which is today's Jakarta in Indonesia. And so from Amsterdam, members of this community were exported globally, as well as remaining and flourishing in the city. Now, throughout this video, I've been referring to them as Portuguese Jews, but not actually all of the Jews that came to Amsterdam had directly come from Portugal. Some had been in exile in other countries. Others had actually come from Spain and had then settled in North Africa or other places and then ended up in Amsterdam.
Yeah, it was a big mix of people coming starting in the late 1500s with the first Jews arriving in Amsterdam, and they would keep coming into the 1700s, some coming straight from Portugal, sometimes they would come from areas in Spain, but like he mentioned, they came from other communities as well. So for some of my family lines, instead of going straight from Portugal to Amsterdam, they're going, like my Nunes Vaz line went Portugal, Livorno, Amsterdam, and then my Senior Cornell line went to Recife, then Hamburg, then Amsterdam. And then I have other cousin lines that ended up in Jamaica or Curacao or Suriname. And like I've gotten in touch with tons of these cousins and done DNA testing to prove for a fact we are related in the ways that we think we are, using Y-DNA, not just autosomal DNA. All right, let's continue.
However, because of the fighting between the Dutch and the Spanish, most of the Jews that settled in the Netherlands, even if they had come from Spain, preferred to identify as Portuguese Jews, also because this became the accepted moniker of the community. Today we might refer to Sephardi or Sephardic Jews, or use the Hebrew plural of Sephardim to refer to this population, as in Hebrew Sepharad is the name that is given to Iberia, or to Spain more specific. Now, apart from those that came from Spain, there were also Jews that had come from Central and from Eastern Europe, who from the 17th century onwards also started to come into the Netherlands. Now, unlike the Portuguese Jewish community, they had actually fled not as a result of official expulsion, but rather because of the violence that was mounting in these areas of Central and Eastern Europe, particularly following the 1618 start of the 30 Years' War, as well as various other riots, pogroms, and rebellions that had targeted Jewish people in these areas. Now, they were not as accepted as the Portuguese Jewish community by either the Gentile Dutch community or the Portuguese Jews already established, and so many of these Ashkenazim actually settled outside of Amsterdam in more rural areas, forming Medina, which are communities in much smaller areas. However, as time went on, some of these Ashkenazim would settle in Amsterdam and form a community there themselves.
The Ashkenazi community in Amsterdam was pretty big itself. I descend from that as well. And their synagogue was actually basically just right across the street, in a sense, from the Portuguese synagogue. So they were actually really close. And while they did deal with each other in various ways, they were quite separate. And as he said, a lot of the Sephardic Jews looked kind of down on them as these kind of like poor, not as well educated, and just like more lowly sort of thing. They would actually make sure that all of their members were truly Sephardic descent by having what was known as the attestation. So when someone wanted to try to join the community from somewhere else, and they had to provide proof, and so they would have letters, attestations from people attesting to, yes, this person is a Portuguese Jew, they were part of this community. And usually it'll come from someone who's well known within that community that it's coming from. So like we have one attestation which comes from London, which is in English, so you can actually see exactly what it says. But let's continue. I think I'm talking too much.
While they were both Jews, there were some significant differences between what became known as the German Jewish population and the Portuguese Jewish population. One was the form of religion that they practiced, as Sephardic Judaism had grown somewhat different to that
Or what we call the minhag, the customs, the traditions.
being practiced in Northern Europe during this time. In terms of language as well, while the Sephardic Jewish population had originally spoken a kind of Portuguese version of Ladino and then switched to Dutch, those coming from Eastern and Central Europe spoke the Yiddish language as their first language.
Not Ladino.
However, despite these differences in communal organization, religious following, and language, unlike in almost every other place where Jews from West and East met, in Amsterdam there was quite a large level of interaction between the two communities, even extending to intermarriage between them.
The intermarriage part is something that is kind of a hard thing for a lot of people to get down because it changes. So pre-1811, basically, it's very scandalous for someone who was Sephardi and Ashkenazi to get married in Amsterdam. The communities were very separate. So if that did happen, usually what would happen is the wife would then become a member of the community of the husband's community. So if the wife was Sephardi, she married an Ashkenazi man, then she would then be part of the Ashkenazi community, and their kids would probably be part of the Ashkenazi community, and thus they wouldn't get any of the benefits of the Sephardic community, the tzedakah, the despachos, all the various things that are available to help support the poor. But then 1811 is kind of the year that a lot of people use because it's also the same year that the civil registration changes in the Netherlands, thanks to Napoleon's rule. But basically, after that sort of the 1811, early 1800s, it became much more common for Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews in Amsterdam to marry each other. And I descend from a marriage of Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews, which traces to the early 1800s, one of the first ones probably in the time of Not As Scandalous, as well as a later marriage in the 1870s, or I guess it would have been more 1880s, 1890s, in London. So the Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews did marry. I'm proof of that, being descended from that, but that was really more common post early 1800s.
In 1671, the German Jews were also allowed to build their own synagogue, which, unlike the Portuguese synagogue, became known as the German synagogue. At the dawn of the 20th century, there were around 51,000 Jews in the Netherlands as a whole, most of those being in Amsterdam. That made up around 2% of the entire Dutch population. As secularization increased, these Jews often formed a rather well-educated underclass inside the Netherlands, with Jews winning the Nobel Prize, becoming prize-winning painters that were well known throughout the Netherlands and abroad, as well as founding many of the largest Dutch companies that still exist to this day. The football team of Ajax in the capital Amsterdam also became known for its connection with the Jewish population, as in 1934 when the Meerstadion was built following chants by the opposition that highlighted the fact that there were many Jews among the supporters, or alternatively that they had to walk through the Jewish area of Amsterdam to get there. The Ajax fans then adopted the chant of Joden, Joden as their own, which means Jews, Jews. Later on throughout their history, they would also adopt the Star of David and many Israeli symbols such as the flag, although of course in the 1930s that was still to come in the future, and their nickname of Super Jews is still used today.
This is something my cousins told me about when I was in Amsterdam recently, because I didn't actually know about this, and they were telling me about how it's actually pretty uncomfortable for them both, that, it's like this part of the culture for the football club that it's like, super Jews, but at the same time, then the opposition, like their whole thing is being crazy anti-Semitic, and that there's been like a lot of issues of anti-Semitism in the Netherlands, which I think it's the Rotterdam team that's the one that's like, anti-Semitic in their chants and stuff. And it's like a big issue. And I know a lot of my cousins in the Netherlands are very uncomfortable about it.
However, in 1940, all of this would come under terrible threat, as the German invasion and subsequent occupation of the Netherlands specifically targeted the Jewish population. In the years running up to the war in the late 1930s, some 30,000 German Jews had sought asylum in the Netherlands after they had been abused and removed from Germany following the rise of the Nazis to power. Now, they would also not be safe in the Netherlands. Of course, Anne Frank and the Frank family are the most famous example, who had moved into the Jordaan neighborhood. The Germans began by taking an official census of the population, and they declared that when they had taken power, there were 154,887 Jews living in the Netherlands, 80,000 of whom lived in Amsterdam. However, by 1947, following war's end, only 14,346 out of that total remained in the Netherlands, meaning that 3/4 of the Jewish population of the Netherlands had been murdered during the war years.
Now, this is a fact that I have seen extensively with my family history and in my Nunes Vaz family line, which traces to my ancestor Jacob Nunes Vaz, who was born in the late 1600s in Livorno and moved to Amsterdam, and that's where all of his descendants come from, and basically are in Amsterdam, come from the Amsterdam community, and all of the family that stayed in Amsterdam during the war were decimated. And I have a graph of the family tree that shows this really well, and I'll put this up on screen where you can see the branches where the family left Amsterdam, and then the branches where the family stayed. And post 1940, where there's or post 1945, where there's that black line I have, that shows all of the family members born after 1945.
It should be noted that that 1947 census in the Netherlands differed slightly in its definition of who counted as a Jewish person than the German census, as the German census was based on national or racial lines, whereas the 1947 census was based on self-identification as Jewish. However, it's still staggering that 3/4 of the entire Jewish population were murdered during the war years. Now, why was this the case? This was significantly higher than most other countries that the Germans had occupied. So had the genteel inhabitants of Amsterdam finally turned on the Jews who they had previously welcomed into their homes? Well, that is part of the answer. The Netherlands did have a national socialist movement, the Nationaal Socialistische Beweging, or NSB, who were involved in hunting down Jews and ratting them out to the German authorities. However, and partially even scarier, I think, is the nonchalance of both many of the genteel population and the Dutch Jewish population in typical Dutch fashion of keep your head down, and we'll see how things go. Things will probably be all right.
Now, one of the things with how the Nazis handled Amsterdam was that they didn't start out harsh with their rule when they first came in and occupied the Netherlands. And because of this, there were a lot of people that were basically like, oh, look, it's not so bad. Everything's fine. They were really just, going after homosexuals and going after, the disabled. And, it was kind of like one of those things. And it wasn't until later, which I think he's about to talk about, where the population in Amsterdam basically did a protest against the occupation. And then things kind of changed from there.
However, at the same time, in February of 1941, the Communist Party of the Netherlands in Amsterdam organized the Februari-staking, or February Strike, which was a general strike as a response to the treatment of Jews and the beginning of deportation of Jewish people from Amsterdam and other parts in the Netherlands. It specifically points out as its aim that they wish the Germans to stop abusing the Jewish population and to stop sending them from their homes. Of course, this strike would have little effect on German policy within the Netherlands, and the Jews would continue to be rounded up and exported to their deaths as the war continued. However, this is the only case in all of occupied Europe in the Second World War.
Now, one thing I do want to note or a couple of things. One, a big part of why they were able to round people up and get such an easy census of all of the people was because the records in the Netherlands were so expansive and just so great that it allowed them to be able to basically figure out and build all of these family trees for tons and tons of people. It's one of the few times in history, in my opinion, where genealogy is really used for terrible and nefarious things. And the Dutch underground realized that. And there was an active campaign they undertook to destroy a set of records known as the bevolking registers, which were basically kind of like a census record, but they would show multiple years of what would happen for a family. So as an example, here I have pulled up the bevolking register for my family. We have my fourth great grandfather, Abraham Nunes Vaz, here, born about 1800. He was actually born 1799. And then here we have his children, Reina, Leah, Isaac, and my third great grandfather, Raphael Nunes Vaz, who was born November 1837. Here it's just limited 1838. But you can see all of their names are crossed out, and that is because they moved. And so we see all of these notes here on this side about information on where they moved, basically addresses. So there's the Vulcan register I have for the family when they moved to London, and it shows that they moved to London and about what date. So you can see all the different people in the family household. And so it was this set of records that the Dutch underground attacked. They went and blew up the archive that held those records. They were successful in being able to destroy enough of the records that it caused the Germans not to be able to know everybody. Basically, the records allowed them to be able to check every single person's cards and make sure they were a true person, whereas this allowed it where the Dutch underground could now make fake cards and the Germans didn't have the records to compare it against. This was famously carried out and led by Willem Orandius, who was actually a homosexual himself, and his last words before being executed for destroying these records was, let it be known that homosexuals are not cowards. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention was that one of the big downsides to the Dutch population in relation to this history is post-war. A lot of the Jews that came back did not come back to people with open arms. In fact, from my understanding from my family members who still live in Amsterdam and come from the survivors of the Holocaust, that basically they were told, we didn't expect you to live, so we didn't keep your stuff. And whatever was stolen from them before the war, it was not likely that they were going to get it back. Property of any sort, or, it was basically just lost. But an interesting thing is that the synagogue survived. And part of that has to do with the fact that they told the Germans, oh, you should stay away from the synagogue, because remember, the synagogue is surrounded by that lower building, and then it has that tall area. But then all the houses in the Netherlands, they're all very tall. They're usually like a couple of stories tall. And because of that, people could see into the synagogue from the houses around. And the synagogue has all these windows. And so they told the Germans, the Nazis, oh, you don't want to use the synagogue because then everybody can see in and they can see what you're doing. And so the Germans purposefully did not use the Portuguese Jewish synagogue. They instead used a theater, which was a little bit down the road from where the synagogue was. And it was right near a zoo where a lot of Jews hid as well. Very interesting history, but I just wanted to mention some of that stuff. So let's continue.
Well, there was a general lack of comprehension by non-Jewish people in the Netherlands of what the Jews had exactly faced, those that had come back from the extermination camps. And many Jews were unable to gain their property or regain their property that they had left before the war had started. This began to change around 1960 when several documentaries were aired on Dutch TV showing the full extent and horror of the Holocaust and the final solution. This began to really change attitudes in the Netherlands, and the Jewish community was given more support by non-Jewish people at this time. Indeed, the Dutch state and the West German state both paid reparations for the Jewish community for what had happened during the Second World War. So today there is a population of around 45,000 Jews in the Netherlands, around a third of whom live in Amsterdam. And Amsterdam is still the city with the most synagogues, the largest Jewish population in all of the Netherlands, and several cultural and educational Jewish centers that can still be seen today.
Okay, that was a pretty great video. Now, I obviously had a few things that I didn't quite agree with. I'd say it's pretty nitpicky overall. I mean, overall, great job covering everything. Talked about a lot of pieces of the history that a lot of people don't cover. Also glossed over a lot of parts of the history that a lot of people still gloss over too. I think the biggest thing that I wasn't a fan of was the whole mix-up of kind of Ladino and Judeo-Spanish being part of the community, which it was not. Like I said, it was Old Portuguese, had nothing to do with those Eastern Sephardic languages that developed. But it's awesome to see a channel like History with Hilbert that's really interesting and does a great job with their research to cover a topic like this. Now, obviously, he's coming from a Dutch ancestry, so he has slightly a connection to it. Now, hopefully you all enjoyed this reaction as well, and if you did and want to see more reactions, be sure to check out this one right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.